Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Sean.
and we're here for the ECOT Public Access Channel for a special presentation of Field Trippin' live from Washington, D.C. Okay, now, first, Sean, I just want to
Chris.
say I enjoy your choice of leather jacket and Irish cap.
I like your choice as well, good
Well,
sir.
thank you.
It looks great.
It does, doesn't it? Especially on us.
It does.
So, Sean, why don't you tell the folks watching at home a little bit about what we will be doing today?
Okay, so today we're going to be touring all of the different monuments here in Washington, D.C. And so we'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes at each monument. You'll get to explore the monuments with us. And then after we're done with each monument, we'll take a short break so that we can travel to the next monument. So Chris, can you tell the students at home, what are they going to be doing while we're moving around to the next monuments?
I can. They're going to be watching this very channel because we'll have other videos to fill in any times that we are walking to a new memorial. So, Sean, we talked again, or at the beginning, about us being in Washington, our nation's capital. I think we need to start with, why is Washington, D.C. the capital of our country?
Yeah, so Washington, D.C., believe it or not, is in the middle of the country. And you might think to yourselves at home, no, it's not. Like, if it was in the middle of the country, it would be like in Nebraska.
Glorious Nebraska.
Glorious Nebraska. But when our country was formed, there was only 13 states, and Washington, D.C. was placed right in the middle of those states because it's not too far north, where the northern states might have a little more political power if the capital was up there. It's not in the south, where the southern states might have a little more political power. It is in the middle of the country when we only had 13 states. So Chris, we talked about the location of Washington, D.C. What can you tell us about how Washington, D.C. was designed?
Sure. So it was originally designed in a 10 by 10 square, which they rotated into a diamond. And actually, George Washington himself had a significant role in designing the layout of the city. Him and along with French architect Pierre Lafont, which my pronunciation is flawless, of course.
Spot on.
Yes.
Sir.
Now, of course, since that time, D.C. has expanded exponentially. But the original layout is, you can still see it from the Capitol to the White House, all the way down through the National Mall.
So let's go ahead and, since we're talking about Washington and Washington, D.C., let's go ahead and start first with the Washington Monument.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Washington Monument was built from 1844 to 1884. So Chris, why did it take so long to build the Washington Monument?
Well, because right in the middle of the construction, the American Civil War started, which was easily the biggest calamity our country has ever faced. And actually, you can see the very spot on the monument where the building stopped. So in the first third of the monument, you have the stone looks lighter, right? And then above that, you can see that there's a different colored stone. It's more brown. And that's because after the Civil War, when they resumed construction, they used a different quarry to get the stone.
All right, so let's talk about the construction of the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument itself is 555 feet tall and 5 1/8 inch on top of that. And here's a fun fact for you, Chris. No other building in Washington, D.C. is allowed to be taller than the Washington Monument.
Yeah, and you know, Sean, at one time it was the tallest building in the entire world. And it stood that title for about, a year until the Eiffel Tower was built, but still very impressive and pretty cool that still no building in DC is allowed to be taller than the Washington Monument.
Yeah, and is actually still today the tallest obelisk in the entire world. So there's no other obelisk taller than the Washington Monument.
Yeah.
So the Washington Monument also contains a lot of Masonic architecture, and so does a lot of the architecture throughout Washington, D.C. And this is because George Washington and a lot of other founding fathers were part of the Masonic order. And so you'll see a lot of their architecture throughout Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And last fun fact here for you. In 2011, there was an earthquake in D.C., and the monument had a little bit of damage to it. So they actually had to shut down the monument for about a year until they fixed it up. So they fix it up. They use a lot of scaffolding. We actually have a student question, right?
Yes, we have two student questions. Our first student question comes from Dixie. How was the Washington Monument made? And that's a great question because the monument is very tall. It's made of stone and marble, and it would be very difficult to create, especially in the 1800s. And they are actually used steam engines to be able to lift up all the different pieces of stone up the scaffolding using block and tackle to piece the stones together one by one to load those up. Yeah. So we also have another question from Nolan. How old is the Washington Monument? So Chris, how old is the Washington Monument?
Well, I hope no math teachers are going to be checking me on this, but the Washington Monument is about 137 years old at this point, so pretty impressive structure here in D.C. Yeah, are we ready to move on from the Washington Monument?
Well, Chris, I got one more question for you.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, Chris, how does the Washington Monument make you feel? Because these monuments are here not only to remind us of different things that are happening throughout Washington, D.C. and throughout the nation's history, but they're here to make us feel something. So how does the Washington Monument make you feel?
Standing here, I feel very much in the shadow of George Washington, right? He was larger than life. He was America's first action hero, really, right? If there was ever the Avengers back in the day, George Washington would have led the Avengers, right? So I feel very much in awe of George Washington, and I think it's symbolic that the Washington Monument towers over everything in D.C. because George Washington towers over everything in American history. I mean, if there was no George Washington, let's face it, there would be no United States of America.
Absolutely. So I think now we are ready to go ahead and turn our attention to the World War II monument. So we actually don't have to take a break here because we are literally going to turn around and we will see the World War II monument. So let's quickly turn around.
So World War II was easily the defining event of the 20th century. And this memorial stands for the 16 million Americans who served in the military, the over 400,000 who died during World War II, and the millions more civilians, men and women, old and young, who did their part to support the war effort at home.
That's right. So let's talk a little bit about how the World War II memorial is designed. So it's actually designed into three main pieces. On the first, you'll see on the left, is the Pacific Theater. This is dedicated to those who fought in the Pacific Theater in the South Pacific. And then also on the right, you'll see something very similar that is the Atlantic side. And then finally, straight behind us, you'll also see the Wall of Honor. And there are 4,048 gold stars representing, each gold star represents 100 Americans who lost their lives during World War II.
Yeah, and I think the inscription above those stars really kind of sum up what it's all about. And it says, "Here we mark the cost of freedom." So let's take a tour of the monuments. Let's start right over here, Tate. So we can see here, it starts on the wall, the World War II Memorial, E Pluribus Unum. That's our national motto. Did you know that? It's Latin, and it means out of many, one. So let's go on down. So here we see that the monument was finished in 2004. Now you might ask yourself, why did it take so long? I mean, World War II ended in 1945. Why did it take so long to get a World War II memorial here? And that's actually an interesting story. It was a man named Roger Durbin. He was a World War II veteran from Toledo, Ohio. And in 1987, he toured DC and he noticed there was nothing for people like him and his generation who helped or served in World War II. So he asked his congresswoman, why is there no memorial? And she said, I don't know. That's a great question. So that very year, she submitted a bill to Congress to build a World War II memorial. It failed, it didn't pass. She submitted it again, still didn't pass. Finally, after 4 years, they passed the law in 1991. And it took until about 2001 for them to pick out the spot, the architects, all of that stuff. And finally, in 2004, it was finished. They really wanted to get it done quickly because at that time, a lot of our World War II generation were getting older. They wanted them to be able to be here to see the monument to everything they accomplished.
And as we go down the walkway, you'll see these different sculptured reliefs that will tell the story of not only the soldiers that fought in World War II, but also those who worked on the home front to help supply the soldiers, who helped sell war bonds to pay for the war, who encountered rationing to make sure that our troops had enough supplies and goods to win the war.
Sean, tell them what rationing is.
So rationing, what would happen is we wanted to make sure that there was enough goods to go around to everybody. The civilians that were still at home, the soldiers who were fighting in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. And so what would happen is you would have to, in order to go to the grocery store and buy coffee or tea or milk, you would have to have a coupon, and you would have to have enough coupons to buy that item. And certain items like gasoline and silk and even food things like coffee were sometimes hard to get because we wanted to make sure that we had enough to go around. And so you would have to save up all these coupons to be able to go and get the groceries that you wanted.
Yeah, and actually there were no cars made in the United States between 1942 and 1945 because every automobile factory was making things for war. Here's a famous mural you might recognize. So you might recognize that this isn't a man, right? This is a woman. This is a depiction of the famous Rosie the Riveter, right? We can do it because 16 million men went off to war. There left a huge gap in the workforce. And guess who filled that? Women. Women made the majority of the factory workers who created the airplanes and the tanks and the vehicles and the bullets and the weapons for our troops to fight the war. So these next two murals here, this depicts paratroopers getting ready to jump out of the plane. And these are troops storming the beach of Normandy. These both depict the D-Day invasion, which was the largest amphibious assault in the history of the entire world. This, in 1944, opened up the Western Front to the Allied soldiers. Germany had control of all of Europe, and it was D-Day, the Battle of Normandy, that allowed the Allies, the United States and England primarily, to gain a foothold on the European continent to drive Germany out.
Our next relief continues the story of World War II in Europe, and this sculpture is going to show the American advance through France, because even though we landed in Normandy and the Normandy invasion was a success, they had to fight their way through hedgerows, and we can kind of see the hedgerows and the walls, and these hedgerows made natural fortifications for the Germans. And so even though we did have a successful invasion of Normandy, we really had to fight hard to break through France and continue the advance to beat the Germans. And as you can see, this continues, the story of World War II continues. In this relief here, we see the Battle of the Bulge, where the American troops are fighting in the dead of winter, fighting back Germans who launched a surprise attack in the Ardennes forest, and was really a brutal battle, especially for those who were cut off, who lacked supplies, lacked medical treatment, and even winter clothing. And our final relief on this wall shows two groups of soldiers. We have the Americans on this side, and we actually have the Soviets, who were allies of the United States during the war, and they are meeting most likely in the middle of Germany. This is when the United States and the Soviet Union and the Allies are victorious in defeating Germany, and they see the two armies meeting together.
And Sean, I love this quote that's inscribed here on the wall. So let's get a shot of this. Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation. not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it. And that's absolutely true. Okay, so we're going to continue around for each individual pillar. And so we said this is the Atlantic side. Now around the pillars, there's 56 pillars, and that stands for the 48 states there were at the time, as well as the territories like DC, Alaska, Hawaii, because they weren't states yet, America, Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico. And each one is named because they all sacrificed people and employment and energy. So this quote here, before we begin the Atlantic side, is by President Franklin Roosevelt. They have given their sons to the military services. They have stoked the furnaces and hurried the factory wheels. They have made the planes and welded the tanks, riveted the ships, and rolled the shells. Let's go see it. So let's come over to the Atlantic pillar. You can see usually when it's warm, they have beautiful water fountains here in the middle that really adds to the beauty of this monument. But as it's, February, they're not on currently. So this pillar marks some of the major battles of the Atlantic Theater of War in Europe. So we talked about D-Day for a minute. General Dwight Eisenhower told the soldiers, "You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle." And you can see along the wall some of the major battles of World War II in the Atlantic Theater of War are listed. When we get up here to the Freedom Wall with the stars, we're gonna pause here for a minute and just look at the stars because each star represents 100 Americans who died in the war. And we're gonna be quiet and stand here for a minute before we move on.
And as we continue through our tour of the World War II monument, we'll go now to the Pacific side of the wall. And just like the Atlantic Wall, the columns continue to show the different territories and states where soldiers came from to fight in World War II. And our first quote is actually from President Harry Truman. Now, you might think Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president during World War II, but he died towards the end of World War II. And Harry Truman was vice president and took over in office in 1945. And this is his quote: "Our debt to the heroic men and valiant women in the service of our country can never be repaid. They have earned our undying gratitude. America will never forget their sacrifices." Yeah, and we'll actually see the Ohio pillar coming up here. And these are victory wreaths that are placed on each column as well, showing that we were victorious in World War II, and the victory came as a result of those who volunteered from each state and territory. And just like on the Atlantic side, we also have some of the names of the largest battles that were fought throughout the Pacific War. And they are broken up by different regions. So in the North Pacific, we see the different battles that were fought. And so we see places like Saipan, the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guinea. And we have some other quotes. The first one here: "The war's end. Today the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won. The skies no longer rain death. The seas bear only commerce. Men everywhere walk upright in the sunlight. The entire world is quietly at peace." We have one more inscription that we'll read over here. This is about the Battle of Midway. This is one of the first major battles of World War II that the United States was involved in. And so it lasted from June 4th to the 7th, 1942. They had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of a war. Even against the greatest of odds, there is something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain defeat to incredible victory.
You know, I think this would be a good time to point out, Sean, that most of our kids watching at home have grown up in a world where the United States is a superpower in the world, right? At the start of World War II, the United States was not a superpower. I think they had, like the 35th largest army in the world or something crazy like that. We were not prepared for World War II. And actually at the end, there's a quote about Pearl Harbor, of course, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, which is what started America into World War II, which had already been going on for years by that point in Europe and Asia. We were completely unprepared, and it was only because all of the people of the United States pulled together. The businesses, the people, the army, the Navy, all pulled together to pull off this incredible victory, save the world from tyranny, and which launched the United States as a superpower. When this quote about the Battle of Midway, the United States was greatly outnumbered by the Japanese Navy and Air Force. They should not have won, but they did.
And also, not only were we outnumbered, but we were out of experience. The Japanese soldiers had been fighting for years. They had all the experience they could bring and could muster, and yet we had these green troops who went in and defeated the Japanese, which became an important battle because it set the tone for the rest of the war. It made sure that the Japanese weren't able to travel as far out in the Pacific Ocean. So let's go ahead and keep moving. And our last inscription is from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it is about Pearl Harbor. And it says, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy no matter how long it takes, may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory.
So, I think this is a good place to sort of talk about how this memorial makes us feel. So, what are your feelings, Sean, standing here?
So, this is one of my favorite monuments because it's massive, just like World War II was. You have a section that represents the Pacific Theater, you have a section that represents the Atlantic Theater, and it all comes together in the Wall of Honor, where all these people, men, women, African Americans, whites, Native Americans, fought, died, made sacrifices to make sure that we as a nation would survive and that the world would no longer face tyranny. So I think it just really brings in together what World War II meant to our nation.
Yeah, this is a very powerful monument for me, and it's very humbling to think about. You know, these people were born during the Great Depression, when 25% of the United States was out of work. Things were bad, and they grew up to save the entire world. It's amazing and very humbling. So, yeah, well, I think at this point we are going to walk next to the Vietnam Wall Memorial, and so...
Hello and welcome back. We are now at the Vietnam War Memorial, and behind us are over 50,000 names of those who were killed in the Vietnam War.
Actually, Sean, I'm going to let you take this one. I'm going to go find a name. I'll be back.
So you may be wondering why we're not filming directly in front of the wall today, and that is because this memorial particularly is very personal. The names of the fallen in the Vietnam War are placed on the wall behind us, and a lot of the loved ones who may have had an uncle, a father, a grandfather do come in, find their names, and it's a very loving moment, and we don't want to interrupt that. So we're going to film from a little further back today. So the wall was built and completed in 1982, and it was made to memorialize those who lost their lives in the Vietnam War. Now, the wall, the reason that the wall was built was because we fought a war in Vietnam. And the reason we fought a war in Vietnam was to try to stop the spread of communism. This was during the height of the Cold War. And the Vietnam War was actually very controversial, and it greatly divided our nation. There was a lot of people who believed we shouldn't be fighting a war in Vietnam. That wasn't a lot of our priority shouldn't be in Vietnam, and they protested against the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, for many of the troops who came home, they did not receive a hero's welcome when they came home from the Vietnam War. A lot of times they were ostracized, they were treated poorly when they came home. And not only was the Vietnam War itself kind of controversial in our American history, but the Vietnam War Memorial itself is going to be controversial as well, because many people believe that it looked too much like a tombstone. There was no ornamentation, there's no grand statues placed out here. It's black granite with the names of those who have fallen. And in fact, one critic called it the black gash of shame, because they believed because it was built into the earth and it wasn't a grand statue or a grand memorial, that we were trying to hide the shame of the Vietnam War by building a memorial that was into the ground. And so again, the original design called for no statues or embellishments. The memorial is composed of a V-shaped sunken wall of black stone with the names of those killed in action engraved in chronological order. So if you look on the left-hand side, it'll start in the 1950s and work its way all the way up to the last men who were killed in the Vietnam War. And so what people do when they come here is they typically search out a loved one or a relative or somebody they knew who fought and died in Vietnam, and they can look in a directory, just like Mr. Stanley is doing. They can go to a particular panel that holds the name of their loved one or the person that they knew, and they can find their name on the wall. And the other thing they can do is, because this is a very tactile memorial, they can go up there, they can touch that name, they can also make a rubbing of the name, which means they're going to take a piece of paper, press it against the wall, and then take a crayon or a colored pencil, and they're going to make a rubbing of it so they can take it home with them, because it is a very personal, very tactile monument. The wall itself is also famous because they actually made a replica of the wall that traveled around the nation, and it was not as big as this wall as a scale model, but it did go around the nation. And eventually, even though this design was originally criticized for being too simple, maybe more like a tombstone, it actually became a very, very personal wall. It became a very healing wall, because you would have veterans who would come and leave different mementos for those who they fought with, everything from flags to medals. One person even left a Harley Davidson here in memorial of the person that that had lost their lives. But this area also contains a couple other statues as well. So if our cameraman will turn around, we'll have a statue that represents the legacy of the women who were involved in the Vietnam War. And over 265,000 American women served during the Vietnam era, 1956 through 1975, and over 11,000 saw duty in Vietnam. The majority served as nurses, caring for the thousands of wounded servicemen in the difficult conditions, crowded transports, harsh weathers, and difficult terrain. And between 1964 and 1973, dedicated nurses tended to over 300,000 wounded, saving nearly 98% of those who eventually reached the hospitals. And so this memorial is dedicated to those nurses who put in a lot of hard, dedicated work in very, very tough conditions. You will notice that there are a couple other structures. They did add an American flag. They did add a statue called the Three Soldier statue. And this was, again, based off of some of the criticism of the fact that it was almost too simple of a memorial, even though it's very personal. It's actually one of the most moving monuments here, because you can go and touch the name of each individual who lost their lives during the Vietnam War. So what I'd like our cameraman to do now is to go ahead and see if we can zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of those individual names. All right, now we have Mr. Stanley back, who was able to find the name of a friend of the family. So, yeah. Chris, tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so from my hometown of Grove City, Ohio, one of my good friend's uncles was killed in the Vietnam War, and his name was Richard Holycross. And I was able to find his name there on the wall, take a picture of it. And I'm sure, Sean, you talked about one of the things about the wall is you can touch it, and it's reflective, and it's very powerful when you go up there. So I wanted to find that name. I'm glad I was able to do that.
So we do have a question from Patrick, and Patrick asked exactly how many names are on the wall, and that's a great question. And there are currently 57,661 names on that wall. And they actually went back and added names to the wall because there were several soldiers who were missing in action. They didn't know if they were still alive, if they were dead, and they were confirmed kills. So there was about 100 names added to the Vietnam War. So Chris, tell me, what are your feelings about the Vietnam War?
About the wall, yeah. It's very somber. I mean, when you go up there, no one even has to tell you to be quiet. You just sense that you should be quiet when you're up there. And, juxtapose this with World War II, right? World War II is glorious. There's victory wreaths everywhere. And yes, there was a huge sacrifice in World War II, obviously, and that's a very solemn spot. But this monument is so different because each individual name is listed. And so, war isn't some sort of abstract concept anymore. It's like, oh, there it is. This person was just like me and died in the war. It really brings it home when you're looking at it up there.
Yeah, and that's really my takeaway too, because it is a very, very personal memorial, because you can look up a name of somebody who died. In the World War II memorial, each star represented 100 troops. Where here you can actually look at the name of each individual person, and it doesn't matter if they're white, black, whatever religion they are on that wall, and you can go and you can touch and you can make a rubbing of that name. You can take a picture of it, and the wall is actually reflective too. It's a very shiny granite, so you see yourself, you see the sacrifices that they made, and you standing there with your freedom as a result. So it, to me, is probably the most moving of all the memorials here at Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Did we talk?
All right, welcome back. And so we are live, and I did make a mistake. We are actually going to come to the Lincoln Memorial next, not the Korean War Memorial. So we are at the Lincoln Memorial. So
That's right.
Here you go, Chris.
Thanks. So, Sean, do you have a $5 bill?
Yes, I do.
Well, let's see it. What we got here? Hey, look at that. It's the Lincoln Memorial. Did you know that you were holding that on your money this whole time? So here we are. So up into this brilliant structure, we see Abraham Lincoln. And there's a quote above where Abraham Lincoln sits. And it says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." And thus sits our 16th president. And he was assassinated in April of 1865 at the conclusion of the Civil War. And 2 years later, Congress appropriated monies to build the Lincoln Memorial. Now, it wasn't completed until 1922. It actually started in 1914. But Sean, we talked earlier at the Washington Monument was stopped for the Civil War. Do you know why construction slowed down for the Lincoln Memorial?
Why is that, Chris?
Because of World War I. Another war slowed down construction of this monument. But it was quickly finished after the close of the war. And you can see right after the Lincoln Memorial was completed, they completed the reflecting pool, which let's get a shot of that here. And you can see clearly in the distance the Washington Monument and the reflecting pool, and you can see that this connects the father of our country with the savior of our country, and that was intentional. So back around to the Lincoln Memorial, this was modeled after the Parthenon in Greece. And again, the architect believed that the man who saved democracy, because really American democracy was still an experiment at that point, that the man who saved democracy should be honored with the birthplace of democracy. So the north and south side of the chambers inside contain inscription of Lincoln's second inaugural address, as well as the Gettysburg Address. Now, the statue of Lincoln himself took over 4 years to complete, just the statue of Lincoln alone in there. And since the 1930s, the Lincoln Memorial has been a symbol of race relations here, right? Because Abraham Lincoln is known as the great emancipator. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the enslaved peoples of the rebelling states of the South. And of course, it was Abraham Lincoln who pushed through the 13th Amendment before his death, outlawing slavery in the United States forever. Now, in 1939, Miriam Anderson, she was African-American performer, was not allowed to play in Constitution Hall. And so the First Lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt.
It was awesome, by the way.
Awesome, and we're going to hear a little bit more about her later. She organized a performance here at the Lincoln Memorial for her, and it drew over 70,000 spectators. But most famously, in August 28th, 1963, it was here, right up those steps, that Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. 250,000 people were here live to see that, and of course many more over the radio and television. And it was 100 years before that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, so it was just more powerful as he was giving this speech for equality and freedom for the oppressed individuals, African Americans of our country. So we're actually going to walk up into the memorial and see the Lincoln statue and some of the inscriptions. Now, when we go up there, we're not allowed to be in front of the camera talking, so we'll sort of stand to the side as we get some footage up there. What do you say, Sean? You ready to roll up there?
That sounds great. And You guys may or may not know, but we are taking some equipment with us, so we will have a case. You might, as we go up the ramp, hear some noise. That's okay. It's not us falling. It's just a big case that we have to carry up. So
it's all part of the experience.
There you go. So
okay, Tate, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay,
All
Sean,
right.
you ready?
I'm ready.
Are you at home ready? Wait a minute. Speaking of you at home, we have a student question from Gabby.
That's right.
Gabby wants to know what is inscribed on the Lincoln Memorial. Gabby, great question. Actually, you can see at the top, and Tate, I'll stand aside so you can zoom in on that. There are the states that are up there. Now, at the time, originally there were 36 states as part of the Union. And I say a union, all of the United States, not including the rebelling states. And so originally it was those 36 states that were inscribed along the side of the Lincoln Memorial. And later on, all the rest of the states were added. So great question, Gabby. Sean, what do you say? We go up there?
Yep, let's go.
Okay.
So as Chris mentioned, this Lincoln Memorial is a very important place for the civil rights movement as well. And if Tate, if you want to come over here and we can take a look at this inscription, this is the exact location where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech that has become so famous over the years and is such an important part of the civil rights movement. All right, so let's go ahead and Chris and Tate are going to go into the monument now. So again, we won't be in front of the camera, but you'll hear us as we talk a little bit more about the inscriptions that are inside the memorial as well.
Here we go.
Should just go that way.
So here is Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is pretty well accepted to be the greatest inaugural address of any president in the history of the United States. And if we swing around, we'll see the statue of Abraham Lincoln itself. Come over here, we'll see the Emancipation Proclamation. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here who gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We'll come around this way. So it's quite a view from up here, as you can see. And so those of you who know me know that Abraham Lincoln is my favorite president. And now those of you who don't know me know that Abraham Lincoln is my favorite president as well. So Sean, how does being here at the Lincoln Memorial make you feel?
So the Lincoln Memorial, I think because I am a Civil War buff as well, and I love how grand they make it because it is kind of a celebration of Lincoln, who saved our nation. And he's also looking over all of Washington, D.C. He's looking at the Washington Memorial. And behind that, you see the Capitol building. And this kind of just represents everything that he helped save and preserve. And not only preserve, but also improve upon. He's going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He's going to push forward the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, and the 14th and 15th to bring some civil rights to the United States, to make us a whole nation and not a divided nation based off of location or race or gender. So I love the Lincoln Memorial.
I can add nothing. That was fantastic. Pretty much sums up my thoughts as well. So where are we going next?
Okay, so this time, for real, we are going to the Korean War Memorial. So after a short break, we'll meet you back here for the Korean War Memorial.
All right.
Welcome back, everybody. We are at the Korean War Memorial, and the Korean War Memorial is dedicated to those soldiers who fought and died during the Korean War. The memorial itself was built in 1995, and it features 19 statues of Korean War soldiers from the U.S. Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force. The statues stand about 7 feet 3 inches tall, and they are representing all racial and ethnic cross-section of the U.S. And you may notice at the soldiers' feet there are granite slabs, and these granite slabs represent the numerous obstacles these men encountered during the war. Also, the juniper bushes represent the terrain, the rough terrain that the soldiers had to go through during the war. You'll also notice the soldiers are wearing their ponchos. The Korean War saw some very, very harsh weather conditions as well. Harsh blizzards would hit, to the extreme heat, to monsoon seasons. And so not only were they facing the enemy soldiers, they're also facing the elements. And there's actually two parts to the Korean War memorial. There are the statues that we see behind us, and then there's also the memorial wall as well. And the memorial wall shows 2,400 different pictures representing the Korean War. It kind of tells the story of the Korean War. And also in the black granite, you can tell it's very reflective. You may not be able to see the pictures on the wall, but you can actually see the reflections of the statues reflecting back. And this is so that there are, when you look at the reflections plus the statues, there are actually a total of 38 soldiers that can be seen between the reflections and the actual statues. And 38 is very symbolic for the Korean War, because the Korean War lasted 38 months. The final deciding line between North and South Korea is along the 38th parallel as well. So let's go ahead and take a moment and just kind of look at the Korean War monument. And as you can see, as we're painting through the different statues of the soldiers, these soldiers, the statues do represent all the different armed forces, the Marines, Navy, military, and Air Force, and the different equipment that they carry. So you see some radio operators, you see some just regular GIs, you may also see some medics in there as well. And so they are also going to, like I said earlier, they are going to represent different racial and cultural lines as well.
And so this monument still has real-world ramifications for us today. Because you probably, if you pay attention to the news, North Korea is in the news an awful lot. And the 38th parallel is still the delineating line between North and South Korea, and it's still a war zone. There was never an official peace treaty. North and South Korea are still technically at war, and it could blow up at any time. So we are still living in 2017 with the ramifications from the Korean War that started in 1950. So, if you ever think history doesn't matter to you, well, it certainly absolutely does, still to this very day in the Korean War. We actually have a student question from Daryl, and Daryl wanted to know, was the Korean War an actual war? And that's actually an interesting question, Daryl, because of course it was a war, right? Thousands of people died, millions of dollars of treasure went into it, but it was never an officially declared war. And actually, Sean, I'm sure you know this, the United States actually hasn't had an official war since World War II.
That's right.
Yeah.
And actually, the Korean War was known as a police action because this was also during the time of the Cold War, where we didn't want to have an open war with somebody that supported or that was supported by the Soviet Union, because there was always the threat of nuclear war. So this became a police action where the United States, along with other members of the UN, tried to take away the aggressor, which was North Korea, and push them back into North Korea when they invaded South Korea. So great question, Dylan.
Yeah, Daryl,
Daryl,
Sean, yeah. But Dylan, I'm sure you had a great question too. But so Harry Truman was the president during the Korean War, and it was actually the first time that an American president sent significant troops. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson sent troops to fight the pirates, right? Yarg. But this was the first time that a president really started a real, actual war, and he thought he had the constitutional mandate to because we signed the treaty with the United Nations, which came into existence after World War II. And so that's an interesting fact. Also fun fact, my grandfather, George Long, was drafted into the United States Marines for the Korean War. And before he could have his swearing-in ceremony, he quickly went and signed up for the Air Force, which I don't blame him. The Marines had a rough time of it in Korea, and he actually served for 22 years in there. But it was Harry Truman who sent him his draft letter, which he still has, and he has mixed feelings about Harry Truman. Sean, that's right.
So like I said before, the United States fought the Korean War along with the UN, which means there were a lot of other nations fighting along with us. So if our cameraman Tate will turn around, there's actually engravings of all the different countries that joined us in a fight in the Korean War. So everyone from Norway, the Philippines, Republic of Korea, which was South Korea, South Africa, Sweden, Turkey, the British came with us as well, and so we also see a dedication to all the different countries as well.
And there goes Marine One. Look at that. So, ladies and gentlemen,
Just had a cameo.
yeah, the President of the United States may just have been on that helicopter. Look at that. Unplanned, but hey, it's Marine One.
All right, Chris, as we do at all the different monuments and memorials, so how does the Korean War Memorial make you feel?
I feel a real sense of sadness for this one because the Korean War it's known as the Forgotten War, right? I mean, 5 years before World War II ended, the biggest war in all of human history, absolute victory for the United States and their allies, and it's a hugely celebrated war. This war, we didn't win. We didn't lose. It was a stalemate, but it cost so many American lives, and there was no real resolution to that war. And we sort of forgot about the Korean War a little bit, and that makes me very sad because these men endured terrible hardships, especially at places like the Chosin Reservoir. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. And so it makes me glad to see this memorial here for these men who faced such terrible conditions in this really forgotten war in American history.
Yeah, and I think this memorial does a great job of building a connection with the viewers because this war did happen and it was kind of known as the Forgotten War. Just being here and kind of walking amongst these statues and then also the memorial wall in the back, seeing all the pictures, kind of gives you a sense of being there, seeing the rough terrain, being there in the cold and wind and snow and ice of Korea, kind of walking along these soldiers with their ponchos on. Gives you a connection with what they experienced.
Yeah. So where are we heading to next?
All right, that's a great question. We're going to take a very short break this time, and we will be walking over to the Martin Luther King Memorial. So stay tuned. We have just a few messages for you, and then we'll be right back.
So we're going to walk through first, and then on the other side, we'll show you where we are. But this is actually one of the newest monuments in D.C., and I have never been here to this monument yet, ever. So I am very excited to be here.
So we are at the Martin Luther King Memorial. We're actually on the back side of the memorial, but it's interesting the way that this memorial is designed because this memorial is based off of a line from Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and the line is, "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." And this represents the mountain of despair. And so when we walk through, we will see the stone of hope. And so we'll walk in and then we'll turn around and we'll continue the tour. So let's go. And so right now we are figuratively passing through the Mountain of Despair on the way to the Stone of Hope. So behind us, you can see the 30-foot high relief of Dr. King that is named the Stone of Hope. And it stands past the two other pieces of granite that symbolizes the Mountain of Despair.
Quick pause for Marine One flying over us. I'm pretty sure that they're very interested in our broadcast, so they keep circling to see what it is. So anyway, let's continue.
I mean, Obama did tell us to.
Right. I mean, if those of you who watched the promo, former President Barack Obama asked us personally to come do this, so they're buzzing us.
That's true. And so as we look behind us, we see the stone relief of Dr. King. And this, like Mr. Stanley said, this is the newest monument here at Washington, D.C. And here's a fun fact. This monument is the only monument not dedicated to a U.S. president or a U.S. war. So this is a very special monument and is dedicated to Dr. King because of the work that he did during the civil rights movement. And so we'll take a second and look at the monument, and then we will then take a look at some of the other parts of the monument, which are inscriptions of different speeches, different sermons and writings of Dr. King. So we'll take a second, let you look at the monument because it is quite impressive, and then we will look at some of the other inscriptions as well. And then we're going to start walking forward, and our cameraman's going to go ahead and continue on looking at the relief of Dr. King here. And you can see the inscription on the side of the relief here, where it does say, "Out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope." And as you can see in the background here, there are other inscriptions of famous quotes from King's speeches, sermons, and writings that are inscribed on this wall on both sides. And some of those include, "We shall overcome because an arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Another one is, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have all the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil, triumphant. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. I oppose the war in Vietnam because I love America. I speak out not against it in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all, with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as a moral example for the world. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, whatever effect one directly affects all indirectly.
So Sean, this is my first time here. So I'm experiencing this for the first time, just like you guys watching at home, a lot of you. So this monument is so inspirational to see, just a few of these snippets, but to know the all too short life, unfortunately, that Dr. King led is absolutely amazing. And, I also feel a little bit of sadness that 100 years after slavery ended, African Americans still had to fight for their rights as American citizens, still 100 years after the Civil War ended. And luckily, we had someone like Dr. King who was able to help us move forward. And it also reminds me that we still have struggles. We have not overcome all of our past, and we're still making those strides. And hopefully, we have more people like Dr. King to lead us towards the future.
Absolutely, and I love the imagery of walking through the mountain of despair and then seeing a stone of hope, and that stone of hope being Dr. King. And it is important that as we look at the different memorials, we see memorials dedicated to the different leaders of the nation who were presidents. We see different war memorials. We see one that is dedicated to a person, and not just a person, but just an idea of equality and a stone of hope for people that may have not had a lot of hope before and have lived under that mountain of despair. So as we continue, we'll continue through the Martin Luther King Memorial, and then we will make our way to the FDR Memorial. So continue with us as we walk on.
Here we go. And don't mind our big trudging case. Yeah, for school. Okay. No tour. So I think, Sean, is this the tidal basin over here?
Tidal basin.
Okay. Tidal basin of the Potomac River.
And we are looking at the tidal basin of Washington, D.C., and if you ever hear about the famous cherry blossoms, these are the trees, and they are actually probably just a couple weeks away from blooming with this warm winter we've had. And these cherry blossoms trees line the tidal basin, and these cherry blossoms were actually a gift from Japan. And every spring, thousands and thousands of people will flock to Washington, D.C. Just to come see these cherry blossoms, because they are quite beautiful and they add quite a bit of scenery, especially when you're looking over the Martin Luther King Memorial and then also the Jefferson Memorial that we'll get to at the end of our tour today. And as we walk, just a reminder, if you ever do come to Washington, D.C., we are only looking at the monuments. There's way, way more things to look at while you're at Washington, D.C. There are the Smithsonian buildings that are actually across from the Washington Monument. So don't forget, if you're here, don't mind that. That's just a very expensive case. Good job, Mr. Stanley.
Watch out for the bumps as you travel DC. They jump up and get you.
And you may notice Washington, D.C., especially on the National Mall, is a very popular place for tourists to come, for families to, who live in the area just to come out and enjoy a nice walk. You'll see a lot of people on bikes and even some people on Segways. When we were at the Lincoln Memorial earlier, I did notice there were several people on Segways roaming through the different monuments. Especially on a lovely day like today, you'll see a lot of people out and walking.
And so you can see, if Tate pans over, there's the Washington Monument. So that's where we started, and we've made a big old loop around. We're not done yet. So we have arrived at a very unique monument here in Washington, D.C., and this is to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president. Now, this monument is interesting because it spreads out over 7.5 acres. So we actually have quite a bit to walk through in this monument. And it covers the 12 years that Franklin Roosevelt was president of the United States. And it covers the era that he represented as well.
Now, that's interesting because you think 12 years, how can that be? President only serves 4 years, and a president can only serve 2 terms. Well, before FDR, there was no law or rule in the Constitution that limited how many terms a president can serve. And FDR would actually serve 4 terms.
So now, here's another fun fact, Sean. This was dedicated May 2nd, 1997. And you know how I know that means it's a great monument?
How's that?
Because May 2nd is my birthday.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. So now we actually do have a question from Jennifer. And Jennifer wanted to know if it's true that FDR was paralyzed. And actually, I'm going to answer that question by having Tate move the camera right over here to this statue, and you can see FDR in his wheelchair. Now, this wheelchair is very similar to the one he actually had in real life. And so late in his life, at the age of 38, FDR actually contracted polio. Okay, so we didn't have a vaccine for polio until 1959. It was not many adults, especially that old, got polio. It was usually gotten by children. And so he actually initially was paralyzed from the neck down. He eventually did get feelings back, but he did stay paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. But what's interesting is most of the public didn't know that. When he would make appearances, he'd either ride up in a car and sit there, or he would have braces on his legs, and he would take his oldest son, he would lock his arm like this, and he would very painfully walk and make his way. He was very determined because at that time, he didn't want it to be seen as weak. Now, we know people who have disabilities are not weak. And FDR is the perfect example of that. But at that time, he didn't want the media and other people to know. And so actually, a lot of the reporters, it was sort of an agreement. They just didn't talk about it.
That's true.
Yeah, so interesting. So now this monument also features sculptures of his dog, Fala. He loved his dog. And the Great Depression, some of his fireside chats, which we'll see, and Eleanor Roosevelt, which this is the only monument to depict a first lady of the president because she was pretty impressive in her own right. We'll talk about her when we get there. This monument also is tactile. It was made because FDR was in a wheelchair. It was made for people with physical impairments to be able to go through and see. There's even braille along the walls that people who are, impaired with their vision can still read what's going on here. Now, running water is an important element in this memorial. So each of the 4 sections of the monument has water. And as you move from room to room, the waterfalls become bigger, become more importance, reflecting the increasing complexity of the presidency marked by first the Great Depression and then World War II. So, yeah. Well, what do you say? Should we go?
We should go. Yeah.
So FDR's first term, 1933, he said, "This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny," and I don't think he even knew how right he would be. Of course, that was his famous speech where he says right here, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
It's a fantastic impersonation you got there.
Thank you. I thought so as well. FDR took control of the presidency at the height of the Great Depression. And now I know you probably have heard of the Great Depression, but think about it like this. At the height of the Great Depression, there were 28 states that had 0 banks open. 0 banks. We were on the verge of financial collapse. And actually, so FDR, during the Great Depression, started a series of radio broadcasts called the Fireside Chats. There was no TV or iPhones. Well, I don't know how they lived. But he talked to the American people on the radio and comforted them with his confidence and what he was going to do. It's amazing stuff. And you can see here's a picture of FDR in a car. We talked about at the beginning how he would roll up in a car and not necessarily get out. And he would roll right up and wave to the people and move along. So here we start, and you can see on the ground here, the second term. So he was elected to his second term in 1936 and took office in 1937. This statue here depicts those fireside chats we talked about a minute ago, where FDR would give addresses on the radio and people gathered around to listen to him, and it really connected him with the American people, really in a way that an American president had not been before, ever, right? Because now the president was in your living room with you, and you were hearing him. And Sean, what do we have right over here?
So what we see over here are statues representing the bread lines that we see during the Great Depression, because people were out of work, they were unable to buy food, so they would have to stand in line, especially in the big cities. The bread line would travel for blocks on blocks. And so we see the representation of people standing in line waiting for bread so they can survive. It's not just a matter of not living comfortably, it was a matter of survival. And at the top you can see the quote, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished."
And, you know, to add on to the financial ruin that was happening to the United States, also in the mid-30s, the Dust Bowl happened in the plains where most of our farming came from, which is the largest man-made disaster in history. We almost lost all of our farmland. And so FDR actually took measures to save that as well. And moving on. So here, if it wasn't, you know, February, this would be running water here. And this would symbolize a dam. Specifically, FDR implemented the New Deal during the Great Depression. And one of the works of the New Deal was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which created a series of dams and rivers, especially in rural areas in the South, the Tennessee Valley area. Now, this did a couple of things. First, it stopped the rampant flooding that happened almost on a continuous basis, and it brought jobs and electricity to these rural places that had not had electricity before. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. Those of you who live in the Cincinnati region, the buildings in Cincinnati, many of them were created by the Works Progress Administration, which is an FDR New Deal program. There are those buildings and parks everywhere. How many of you have gone to the Hocking Hills and hiked those trails?
FDR.
Right?
Yep.
The Civilian Conservation Corps. It goes on and on and on with the things that the programs under FDR's administration that still impact us every day.
And so as we talk about these different programs, they were part of, as Chris said, a part of the New Deal. And the New Deal actually had three different parts. There was a relief part, a recovery part, and a reform part. And so the relief, we actually saw the breadlines, some social welfare, to get people fed, get people housed. And that was the relief part. The recovery part were these work programs where we were building dams, building roads, building reservoirs. And so this is the section that we see as well. And then there's finally the reform part to make sure that we had laws in place to make sure that another Great Depression couldn't happen again.
Yeah. And so we'll move along to the next section now, but you can see over here as we go along, here are some of the braille that's inside of this monument here. So now, and as you can see on the ground here, we are getting ready to enter the third term of Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1940, and he served from 1941 to 1945. And for as big as an impact as Franklin Roosevelt's administration had for the Great Depression, this may be the most impactful of them all. It was his third term, that FDR served as president during the Second World War. And he says up here, we must be the greatest arsenal of democracy. So you can see these granite slabs over here. I hate war. And these slabs represent the destruction that the war brought. Yeah, we actually have we're teachers. We're just doing this for our students.
Well, then have fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for telling me.
Oh, no,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Well, that's great news.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we'll have fun.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We appreciate
You
it.
just need to double check,
Oh,
so.
absolutely.
Thank
Yes.
you for
Yeah,
being
thank
here.
you. Sure. Yeah, we're. And again, so FDR says, I have seen war, I hate war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. But war came to us nonetheless. And so here is a statue of FDR and his beloved dog, Fala. So this quote along this wall says, "More than an end to war, we want an end to the beginnings of all wars." FDR was crucial in helping to create what would become the United Nations after the end of World War II, which is still in effect to this very day. So again, we would have water here in the warmer weather, but this is a mural of the refugees after World War II. And there were many. I mean, Europe and Asia were completely destroyed. I mean, completely destroyed. It's hard to fathom even today. Did you want to say something, Sean?
And it is important because we do see a lot of refugees coming to different parts of America because we see places in France and Italy, all around the world, were completely destroyed. Homes were destroyed. Entire cities were leveled. And so these people needed a home, and the United States stepped up and took those refugees into the nation to make our nation even stronger.
Okay, so we are coming to an end of a third term. We're going to FDR's final term right around the corner here. Now, before we do that, we're going to stop here and look at Eleanor Roosevelt. So here is the statue of Eleanor Roosevelt. And again, the only monument where a first lady is depicted because she was so much more. Eleanor Roosevelt actually was the first United States delegate to the United Nations, and she was integral in helping the United Nations to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is still in use to this very day. So the only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith. So as we come to the end of the monument, FDR actually died not too long after he was inaugurated into his fourth term. He had a stroke and he died, and he actually died before the end of World War II and in April. And actually Adolf Hitler, when he heard that FDR had died, was hopeful. He thought that, you know what, maybe Germany could defeat the United States. Of course, that didn't happen. Harry Truman took over. He was vice president, took over as president, and saw the duration of the war out. So FDR was actually listed on a whole list of casualties. FDR was listed as commander-in-chief because it was thought that all of the stress from the war made his blood pressure skyrocket over those years, which caused his stroke.
That's right. And if you think about it, think of all of the different things that FDR had to deal with during his presidency. He took over with America economically in shambles in the Great Depression. He helped us recover from the Great Depression and then took us into a world war that with the likes of the world has never seen again and hopefully will never see again, and led the way to not only bring freedom for us here in the United States, but to end tyranny, to end the Nazis' takeover of Europe, to help end the Japanese takeover of Asia, and bring freedom around the world.
Yeah. Okay, so we just have this last little leg here, and then I think we have a commercial, if I'm not mistaken. So
We do, and
here we go.
After our commercial break, we'll hit our last monument, which will be the Jefferson Memorial.
Yep.
That's true. We'll have a commercial, or not a
Yes.
commercial break, but a video.
A video break, and then we will have our ending. So let's do it. All right, so I believe this is our last stop,
This
Sean.
is our final stop.
So before we begin, can we get a step count?
So
What do
we are officially at close to 15,000 steps today. So
Yeah.
that's about 6 miles.
Okay, well,
So-
I'm leaving.
So this is our final stop, and we didn't quite make it all the way to the Jefferson Memorial because we were starting to run out of time in our live stream. So we will do it from here. We have a beautiful view of the Jefferson Memorial over the tidal basin here. And so the Jefferson Memorial was finished in 1943. Again, like so many of the other monuments, the construction on it was delayed because of World War II. So that's why it doesn't get finished until 1943. And if you notice, unlike the Lincoln Memorial that was a Greek design, Jefferson more favored the Roman style. So it's more like a pantheon in Roman architecture. And as you can see, the Jefferson Memorial sits over the tidal basin, and it brings a beautiful view, especially at night when it's all lit up. It looks absolutely fantastic. And so the memorial is really meant to reflect Jefferson's accomplishments, including being a scientist, an architect, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and a U.S. president.
And pirate hunter and fighter.
right.
Ah, it's us on the tidal basin here. So, so Sean, the Marine hymn, right? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. That's from when Thomas Jefferson was president. So back then, the Barbary pirates who were stationed in Tripoli were attacking shipping, not just of the United States, all over Europe.
That's right.
And Jefferson wanted to put an end to it. So usually these Barbary pirates would say to the governments of these countries, hey, pay us a bribe, we won't attack your ship. And countries did, including the United States.
For a very long time.
For a very long time. And so these pirates are, har, in me gold. They're having a good old time, right? Well, Jefferson said, okay, I'm tired of paying these pirates. And he sent the Marines over there to destroy the Barbary pirates.
Right. Not only did he send the Marines, but he also developed the Navy so that he could have ships to send over and defeat the Barbary pirates. So,
Yeah.
so very awesome. With that, who knew that Thomas Jefferson is the U.S. president who fought pirates?
Yeah, and you mentioned his accomplishments in science, and he had many. But there was a couple of things that he invented, like the swivel chair.
So when you're sitting
yeah.
at your desk and you're spinning around.
The swivel chair, and
Thanks, Thomas Jefferson.
the lazy Susan. Thomas Jefferson really dug things that spun. He really was into that. He would have been a huge fan of Twister and the sit and spins. So just a couple of things that he invented.
So there is a large statue, a 19-foot bronze statue of Thomas Jefferson in the Jefferson Memorial. And originally, it was actually made of plaster, not bronze. Again, this was built during World War II. So why do you think they made it out of plaster instead of bronze? Well, because they needed the bronze for the war. They needed bronze for shell casings and war materials, so they made it out of plaster first. And then after the war was over, they recast the statue in bronze instead of casting it in plaster. So the walls inside the Jefferson Memorial are also engraved with important sayings of Thomas Jefferson, including the Declaration of Independence. Specifically, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, and those are beautiful words, and actually Abraham Lincoln went back to those words during the Civil War. But what's ironic about that is Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. And so that's sort of hard to reconcile, right? Such beautiful eloquence on all men being created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. But he owned slaves, and he didn't even free his slaves upon his death, which is odd. Those two don't mesh. And so certainly there is some controversy around Thomas Jefferson, but you can't deny he made a huge impact on our country.
Yeah, and as we talk about how the different monuments make us feel, and I think that is the way that the Jefferson Memorial makes me feel. It makes me feel like our history is a very interesting history, in the fact that it's complicated. It is very complicated. On one hand, we have a president that's really fought for inalienable rights for the citizens against a tyrannical government. Thank you. It's been a long day, folks. But on the other hand, was a slave owner. And I think that is a reflection on our country as well. We've had a complicated history, and so we're here to make it better.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I think that is the end of our tour of some of the monuments of D.C. I'm tired.
I am very tired.
Tate?
Definitely tired.
Yeah. So now we've talked about, for all these monuments, how they've made us feel. So for you watching at home, we would like to know how these monuments made you feel. So if you could send your teacher a message in iCutie, call them on the phone, tell them how these monuments made you feel. They're going to forward them on to us, and maybe we will answer them in a future episode of Field Trippin'. So speaking of Field Trippin', I'm Chris.
I'm Sean.
And we will see you next time on our next adventure.